Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar to discuss UAE market access and opportunities. My name is Caoimhín O'Donnell, and I'm the CEO of Waystone's combined distribution and management company in the UAE. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by some of Waystone's subject matter experts in both product and region. Firstly, we have Nigel Passia. Nigel is the country head of Waystone's Middle East business and has led the business for the last 15 years. He is widely regarded as the most experienced regulatory and compliance professional within the UAE, with a career spanning over 4 decades, encompassing organisations such as UBS, General Re, Bear Stearns, Deloitte, and the UK financial services regulator, the FCA. Nigel has been based in the UAE nearly 20 years, advising a wide range of financial services businesses, banks, broker-dealers, global fund and asset managers, product distributors, and private wealth advisory businesses. After that, we have Selma Coffey. Selma leads our distribution solutions for Waystone globally and is a former CEO of Waystone's European regulated distribution firm. Throughout her 25-year career, which includes stints at PFPC International and the Man Group, she has maintained a focus on supporting clients in navigating the often complex challenges they face in distributing products both cross-border and to diverse investors. We also have Noelle White. Noelle is the product lead in structuring and is responsible for defining and developing the management company products. With extensive experience in various investment funds, including UCITS, exchange-traded funds, and alternative fund models such as private equity, private debt, and venture capital, her role aims to expand Waystone's product offerings globally for both existing and new clients. First off, let's start with you, Nigel. Can you discuss the regulatory landscape?
Yes, thank you, Caoimhín. I think as part of the scene and context setting, it's important to note that from a regulatory point of view, the UAE has three distinct geographical regions. There are the two so-called financial free zones, namely the Dubai International Financial Centre and the Abu Dhabi Global Market. And then there's the rest of the country, which is often labelled as mainland UAE. Different legal and regulatory regimes apply in each region, so it's important to be cognizant of this fact. The two financial free zones, DIFC and ADGM, have a legal system based on English common law and a regulatory system derived from the UK Financial Services Authority at that time, around 2003. And so the concepts will be familiar to many. A set of core principles supported by modular rule books covering conduct, prudential regulation, AML, and others. The mainland legal system is based on traditional laws of the UAE, shaped by both Sharia concepts and international influence, and is largely in the Arabic language. The regulatory system onshore traditionally focused on the retail banks and the broker-dealers, but that product range has been expanding in recent years to encompass, for example, funds, FX, and payment service providers. In developing regulations for these relatively newly in scope products, the onshore regulator, which is known as the Securities and Commodities Authority, or ESCA, has been looking to incorporate international best practice. As these three regulatory zones have developed, the trend we see is that the two financial free zones have been very successful in attracting sell-side institutions, but the buy-side, i.e. the investors, are typically located outside the two financial free zones and in the UAE mainland. So it's really important, particularly when distributing funds to investors based in the UAE mainland, to understand in particular the ESCA rules governing this practice. And there has been changes in that regard. What's changed? Well, traditionally, fund distribution to professional investors based in the UAE has had the benefit of extremely light touch regulation. Provided the fund was domiciled in a recognized jurisdiction such as Cayman or Luxembourg, it was possible to distribute that fund on a private placement basis to professional investors without any real regulatory intervention. Similarly, it was even possible to promote non-UAE funds to retail investors, providing some procedural requirements for registration and distribution were met. However, new rules were announced in 2023 and implemented in full in April 2024 that meant, firstly, it was no longer possible to market foreign domiciled funds to UAE professional investors, even on a private placement basis, unless that fund had first received ESCO approval through a registration process. And secondly, that the placement to the UAE-based investor was intermediated through an approved ESCO license promoter. Those regulations did carve out from the class of professional investors affected government agencies, including sovereign wealth funds, but all other professional investors would be subject to this rule, or distribution to all other professional investors would be subject to this rule. So that would include banks, family offices, corporates, and other institutions. Secondly, with effect from April 2024, it ceased to be possible to market any non-UAE domiciled funds to retail investors at all. From that date, only UAE domiciled funds could be distributed to retail investors. Why did ESCO introduce these changes? Well, the changes, while dramatic in effect, are in reality nothing more than bringing mainland UAE into line with regulations that we see globally. In particular, the UAE was not in line with equivalent regulations in place in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and therefore needed to be harmonized. This was particularly important objective since it was a prerequisite prior to any GCC funds passport arrangements being enacted that there was harmonization between the 6 GCC states. My colleague Noel will, I'm sure, be talking about the current status of the GCC passport, but I understand that it's expected to be announced in the second half of this year. Solutions and options to address these new requirements. Well, as mentioned, these requirements are not new when you look at global regulation, and we've faced these challenges re-market access before, and most recently re-market access for non-UAE firms, including UK firms post-Brexit, to the important EU market. To solve that regulatory challenge, Waystone established a licensed distributor and a regulated management company in the EU. The UAE changes brought the country into line with similar regulations in the EU, and so the solution that has worked so successfully in Europe is to be introduced into the UAE. Shortly, my colleague Noel will describe the Manco solution and how that can be used to access the UAE retail market. But first, I will ask my colleague Selma Coffey to talk through the proposed market access solution, refund distribution to professional investors. Over to you, Selma.
Thanks, Nigel. Really appreciate that. That's a really great scene setter for where we are today, I guess, in UAE and potentially across the region. And I guess really what we kind of want to talk through as well is, it's great understanding that regulatory change has occurred, but what does that really mean in practice? And, Noel, if I can ask you to come in and add in this piece too, because to my mind, I think the requirements around distribution and how managers can grow funds in the region are very intrinsically linked, I would say, with the changes that have happened in the governance framework for the management company side too. And what I mean by that is, now that UAE is beginning to look a little bit more like where we see in Europe and to some extent in the US, really what this does is it gives regulatory certainty for when you're coming into a region as to how you can navigate, how you can approach investors in a way that keeps you within the regulations, but allows that relationship to flow and allows investors to bring money into funds so both sides benefit. And really what you always want to consider now when you're coming to the UAE is about 70% sit on this mainland UAE concept rather than in the free zones, and that will be particularly, your family offices, your professional investors in terms of high net worth, so sophisticated, I guess you would call them in the US, and the probably opt-up professional investor for those of you who sit in Europe in the moment and wondering that concept. So professional investor in the UAE is a bit of a wider concept than it potentially would be elsewhere. And that makes things a little bit easier for when you're looking at suitability requirements, when you're looking at who you can approach, because they're quite clear as to what those boxes cover. The other thing you need to consider, and this is a great way to do what we call testing the markets here, is now that you can clearly register your foreign fund with ESCA. So in one way, yes, there's a bit more of a structure to go through. But what that means is once it's registered, it's clear that the regulator has considered it suitable for the local professional investor market, and you can treat it on that basis. And again, same concept to the way in Europe that a fund is permitted to be marketed, and then the entity doing the marketing has to have its own set of permissions. And in the UAE case, this means you need a local promoter to support you in how you're accessing investors in region. And those investors as well, they've got a very broad range of interests. We see private debt there, we'll see real estate there, and also, which is one I think that people don't often consider when they consider the Middle East, is potential sustainability lens. And this can kind of often come in through the Sharia focus and the Arabic influence. So I think that's one to be borne in mind too, that there's a very broad range of investor appetite there. And the other thing about UAE, which we've consistently seen, is that it's really going to become a stepping board for access into the rest of the region. And Noelle, I guess from your perspective, when a manager has brought a foreign fund in, they've tested the waters, they have investors that have said, we really like your foreign fund, we'd like to invest. And we know there's interest in region, and what we'd like to do next is we want to keep our footprint with UAE, but we'd also maybe like to talk to Saudi or to Kuwait, and how do we do that? But our foreign fund, we don't want to take the steps of registering our foreign fund in each state. Where do you see the changes benefiting there?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think the changes in the regulations have, I think, factored in two aspects to what you're speaking of there. The first piece is, okay, I still want to market my existing fund in the region. Can I continue to do that? And you've hit the nail on the head there. As long as you are solely marketing to professional investors, you can continue to market your fund in the region, but you must register your fund with the onshore regulator, that's the SCA, and you must also have a locally regulated promoter in order to do that. So while there are some minor barriers there that can be easily overcome, you can continue to market your fund in the region. So the question then raises, well, why would I need a local fund then? Or, what would be the persuasion to do that? And there's a couple of reasons behind that. So the first one is, if you want to target retail investors, that's local investors, as you said, could be about 70% in that wealth space, you have to have a local fund with a local management company, regulated in region, and registered with the SCA. That's one. The second thing is, exactly as you said, I've tapped into the region. I can see appetite for my product here, but I really want to market it more widely into the, other GCC states. Do I have to now go to each of those states to access and register and begin that process to market my fund there? The answer is you don't, or you won't soon enough, because there are changes also being implemented, and the introduction of a GCC passport within the region. And Nigel spoke to that earlier, where you can access each of the 6 GCC states with your existing onshore fund, and that's the key to it. It has to be a local regulated onshore fund that can have access to the passport, the GCC passport, and therefore you can market your fund widely throughout that region. There's 2 things just to bear in mind about that. It's very similar to the European passport in that the product can be passported. It's dissimilar to Europe in that the promoter piece cannot be passported. So you'll still need a local promoter in each of those regions in order to market your fund in line with the regulations. But the key to that point is if you want to market your existing fund in to institutional and professional investors, yes, you can continue to do that. You cannot access the passport. If you have funds that are registered in the DIFC or the ADGM, and you want to passport those into onshore, yes, you can continue to do that presently, but you can't access the GCC passport with those funds either. So you have to have a fund that is a local fund. And that's where you need a management company, really. And what we're working to do is to assist our clients in terms of placing a feeder fund or a local fund on an existing platform that we have in place. So another thing around the management company that I just want to touch on here as well, that's slightly different to Europe, that a lot of people will be familiar with, but is more similar to the UK, is that the structure of the funds in the UAE is a one board, one product solution. So it is a single entity, corporate entity, upon which the board of that entity are responsible for the funds, and in the eyes of the regulator, they are the holders and the masters of those funds, and they oversee, as we have on screen there, the risk management, the delegate oversight, operational oversight of those funds. So Waystone have the license to do that, and we are operationally able to do that very similar to as we do in Europe and in the UK. And that's basically what you require if you want to have a local fund to access the GCC passport and to also access that 70% pool that you mentioned.
And Noelle, I think it's probably worth calling out at this one that there's two other anomalies that I think people should, you know, be aware of. And one is you'll hear a lot of talk about using the feeder fund to access retail in region, and particularly post GCC passport coming in. But isn't there also an important nuance that actually you can have that similar concept for a private fund setting up as a feeder to access, and so similar to the European concept? Would you just talk through that a little bit? I think might be helpful.
Exactly, yeah. So that's some inquiries that we have had. So exactly as you said, it's a private or a private fund that has been marketed into professional investors by some of our clients in the same way. They too can set up a feeder fund or a local fund that can feed into their master fund, be it in Europe, in Cayman, in the UK, and access basically the local investors through that, or local passport through that means, and then feed up into their master fund outside the region. But it must be a regulated fund outside the region, in the eyes of the regulator. So then just pop back to you, Selma, if there's anything further that you want to add there, just in terms of the access or that distribution point or promotion point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is. It's going to be key to look at how you thoughtfully partner with promoter and region. And the other couple of things to bear in mind, like any other new region you're going into, is just, I would say, importance of brand building. Yes, that really is to the fore, but what really is important in region is longevity of relationship. So taking the time, even if your strategy is actually to come into the UAE or Middle East market in 3 to 5 years' time, actually beginning to build familiarity there now, developing those relationships with your potential investors from now, to give yourself time to build into that strategy. So it is great, you know, being able to bring a foreign fund in now, you know, test the waters with it very much, and bring in a few investors. But I just think, for me, that's one of the really key things, is look at the strength of your relationships. If you haven't got those relationships yet, look at who you could work with or partner with, whether it's a placement agent, a local agency, whoever it happens to be, to just get those relationships building. So I think that's one thing that's we always want to take away from these, if you like, is just that understanding of the market. Yeah.
I very much agree with you on that. I think if I was to look and advise anybody looking at the region, I'd very much go in and test the waters, and properly assess the market as to appetite for your product. And then, the stepping stone kind of way. And that leads me on nicely to kind of loop back to Nigel, that maybe you've done this, maybe you see a great flavour in the market, maybe you see great potential for growth there, and you potentially want to put boots on the ground and, develop your business more. So Nigel, maybe you can just speak very, briefly around what your team can do there to help if someone really wants to set up their own office there and kind of evolve further.
Yes, I'd love to. So the distribution and Manco solutions that Selma and Noelle have been talking about have really been targeted at non-UAE based fund managers looking to access the UAE market or fund distribution without having to establish a local presence. Obviously, it may be that the evolution of the firm's UAE business model may result in the firm looking to establish such a permanent presence in the country. That may be because they feel there's a benefit in having closer proximity to clients and investors. Sometimes you also see that personal and corporate taxation plays a large part on that decision-making process. But whatever, if you are going to put boots on the ground and they are going to either distribute funds or actually even have managers, portfolio managers based here, that of course is a licensable activity, and you will therefore, or the firm will therefore need to get the appropriate regulatory license, whether from one of the two financial free zones or from the mainland UAE regulator. We can certainly assist. That's what we've been doing here since 2006. We've probably assisted well over 400 firms get the appropriate license, and we do cover all the relevant jurisdictions. And we also can provide ongoing support in terms of compliance, AML, finance, COSEC, data protection, payroll, and even visa processing, should you go down that decision to actually establish a local presence and put boots on the ground. Quiveen, I believe you may have some questions that were received from the attendees on registration that you'd like to put to us.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Nigel. Yes, I've just selected a couple of questions that out of the ones that we've received. You've each mentioned about regulations and how they've changed recently, especially in terms of distribution of funds in the UAE. What are the consequences for firms that don't comply with our new regulations? I'll put that one to Nigel first.
Thanks, Quiveen. Yes, what are the consequences? Well, obviously, it's a regulation. If you don't comply with it, you are leaving yourselves open to regulatory and regulatory disciplinary action from the regulator. To be honest, I haven't seen any such action, particularly if you're limiting yourself to the professional space. But should it happen, then that's obviously a major hit to your reputation, which no firm would want. But I think the real risk is actually more of a commercial risk. Doing business on an unlicensed basis, when a license is required, potentially gives the investor a right to apply to the courts and have that contract set aside, which they may do if the investment they've acquired has not performed well. And it's kind of a black and white situation there. Did you have a license? No. Well, then the courts will definitely side with the investor. So I would urge firms to be very careful about continuing to do business post these changes without going through the appropriate routes.
Thanks, Nigel. Appreciate that. Now, there's always been a sizable opportunities in the UAE and the wider GCC. So we've seen a surge in interest over the last couple of years, certainly within the Waystone Group. What's so different now, and is it sustainable? I'll put that one to Salma.
Thanks, Quiveen. What's so different now? I think actually it does feed back to that initial round, or the latest round of regulation has given clarity as to how you navigate in region. That's what's different. The other element that's different is if you look at the region as a whole, there's a number of targets the governments have set. They've got growth targets. People want to achieve on the sustainability space. They want to achieve in making sure they're no longer reliant on one particular thing. Historically would have been oil. More recently, it's probably more the tourism industry, and it's allowing an investment space for growth. Kind of indicative of that, I think, with both UAE and has followed Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in this, in that they're putting in pension fund requirements that are obligatory for employers. That wasn't there before. It's looking for long-term growth in the region, and I think that these regulations have codified that to a certain extent, and I think between those two, it shows us that growth really is sustainable, and it's now sustainable within a fairly vibrant environment that is relatively fast-paced, but does at least have that regulatory clarity to help you navigate. So you have a large market there that's interested in investments. it's sustainable, and you have then regulation that's being helpful in underpinning what you need to do to approach that market. That would be my summing up of why we're going to continue to see growth in region.
Thank you, Salma. I suppose in the interest of equality, Noelle, a question for you. Looking at the recent regulatory changes, for managers, are they obligated to establish a UAE local fund? And what are the benefits to them if they do?
Oh, as we mentioned earlier, like you're not obligated. You can continue to market your existing fund into the region, as long as you're solely targeting professional investors. But with the evolution that even Selma is speaking of and the growth in the region, it might be a smart thing to do to start thinking about a local fund and what that fund could do for your business in terms of the investor base that it can target through the GCC passport, as we mentioned. So there's a lot of opportunity there if you do establish a local fund, but you're no way obligated to do so yet.
Okay, thank you, Noelle. So I would like to thank all the panelists today for their time. And I would ask them if they could just provide one key takeaway that they would like all of the listeners to have today. So if we could start there with Noelle, please.
Sure. Even harking back to that point, look at who your investor base is, what is best for them, and what is their appetite, and then go from there in terms of whether or not you want to continue to market into the region as you do, or get that local fund established. And if you do, start planning now, because the time is now to start thinking about that.
And Salma?
Very similar to Noelle. I think it's looking and factoring the region into your essentially near to medium term distribution plans. Will it fit in? Will it work on both sides? And also very much within the next 1 to 5 years, if you are considering the region, plan early for your relationship building in as much as how you're going to bring your strategy to market. I think those two will be very key for being successful there, and understanding you need to understand that the local environment to be successful there.
Thank you, Salma. And Nigel, from you?
I guess I would just highlight that although the recent changes seem dramatic and daunting, in reality, it's just brought the UAE onto the same level of regulation as that most firms will be experiencing just about anywhere else in the world. And although there may be a few more hurdles that they need to jump across now, they are definitely navigable hurdles. And certainly there are solutions which will enable firms to continue to access the UAE market, whether on a remote basis through a distributor, or all the way to the other end of the spectrum, whether by establishing boots on the ground. There's options available.
Thank you, Nigel. So that concludes our webinar, and I hope you enjoyed it today and found it informational. And should you wish to discuss any of these topics further, please feel free to reach out to one of us directly or to your usual contact in the Waystone Group. Thank you very much.